Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to host this important event on the incoming Sheinbaum administration in Mexico and what it could mean for the United States. When I say I, my name is Eric Farnsworth with the Council of the Americas, and we are so delighted to have the opportunity to partner, and it is a true partnership with COMEXI, a real leader in these issues in Mexico and a real friendly voice for the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So thank you to our COMEXI collaborators today. And we're also delighted to have significant support for our Mexico activities in 2024 from Medtronic, MetLife, and TC Energía. And so they make programs like this possible to bring to all of you. Unfortunately, COMEXI President Sergio Alcocer has been called away on a family emergency, so he's unable to join us, but Amy Glover is here in his place, and we're delighted to have Amy join us. And we also have an amazing lineup of speakers as panelists today, and we're really looking forward to hearing from each of them. There's perhaps no country in the world more important to the United States than Mexico on democracy, trade, migration, and borders. Fentanyl and other illegal narcotics, water use, and the environment, it's all there. What happens in Mexico doesn't necessarily stay in Mexico. Just as, frankly, what happens in the United States directly impacts our southern neighbor as well. And so it's critically important to analyze the impact of the new Mexican government on North America in order to gain insights into potential policy shifts, trade and economic strategies, and diplomatic priorities and orientations of the new administration. We're neighbors, but can we also be partners and friends? That's what we're here today to find out. And we have three terrific panelists, José Antonio Meade, Pamela Starr, and Kimberly Breier. Their biographic information is linked on this platform for those who may want to review their backgrounds. But just very briefly, in reverse order of how they'll be speaking, José Antonio is an independent non-executive director of HSBC, and he's a senior minister from previous governments in Mexico, as you all know. Kim Breier is the former Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere. She's now a senior advisor with Covington Burling. And Pam Starr is a top-flight academic at USC, the University of Southern California, and she's also a consultant with Monarch Global Strategies. We welcome all of them, all of you, to our program today. We're going to start with Pam Starr. Pam, thank you for getting up early to join us from the West Coast. It is a real pleasure to see you today. You know, you're a keen observer of Mexico for many years. What do you anticipate the priorities will be of the incoming Sheinbaum administration? And based on those priorities, how do you see the relationship between Mexico and the United States developing over the next 6 years?
But to be honest, I think her priorities, particularly in the early part of administration, will be no different than López Obrador's priorities. Let me explain why I think that's the case. Sheinbaum herself is a true believer in the fourth transformation, and she's a very loyal follower of López Obrador. She's been loyal to him for years, and it's a characteristic of her that the fact that she tends to be maintain her loyalties. But I think she'll bring a different approach to governing from López Obrador. He is much more of a politician. She's much more of a technician. She showed that as mayor of Mexico City, where she's focused on getting things done in her government. Whereas López Obrador's focus was almost exclusively on breaking the back of the opposition, the conservatives, as he called them, and strengthening his movement politically to make sure that it would have power in Mexico over the long term. And López Obrador, in addition to that, sees himself as a pivotal figure in Mexican history. He sees himself like Juárez or Cárdenas in Mexican history. And he also sees himself, with a bit of hubris, as the only person who can really plant the transformation, the fourth transformation, deeply in Mexican politics, in Mexican society, and the Mexican economy. So he's taken it upon himself to construct an agenda for Claudia Sheinbaum to follow during her first year or so of government, whether she agrees with that or not. He announced that on February 4th. He created the to-do list. And it doesn't matter whether some of these things get done in September. The judicial reform got done in September. We'll see where that goes from here. and also probably transferring the National Guard to the military constitutionally. But she's stuck with this agenda because of López Obrador's complete control over the Morena movement, which blindly is loyal to him, follows everything he says and does, and that, as everybody now knows, has a 2/3 majority in the national legislature and a control of 27 out of 32 state houses or state legislatures, which will allow it to change the Constitution at will. But more than that, Morena is so loyal to López Obrador, it means it will be loyal to Claudia Sheinbaum as long as it believes she is implementing López Obrador's agenda. And so if she moderates, particularly the more radical wing, the puros as they're known, the radical wing of Morena, is apt to scream loudly. And just this past week, López Obrador announced that his son and namesake, Andy López Beltrán, is now going to enter politics, be a key figure within Morena. And even if he's not, everyone is going to believe that he is López Obrador's conduit into politics. And so if he disagrees with Sheinbaum, it's going to be hard for her. So all of these things, her personality, her belief in the fourth transformation, but also all these constraints López Obrador have put on her, means that she's going to be very constrained initially. Now, I think over time, she will generate her own government. The powers of the presidency are enormous in Mexico. She is going to reinstitute no re-election in Mexico, which will give her power over the future political futures of Morena politicians. But this will take time. And there's also that recall referendum that's still out there in Mexican politics, which probably means she'll be limited in what she can do for the first 3 years of her presidency before she'll be more independent. So what does that mean for the United States? It means continuity in most of what we've seen in the policies of López Obrador, albeit with some important changes. So there's a lot that matters, but let me just mention 3 things. First is the question of the USMCA, the TEMEC, as it's known in Mexico. And there's questions about, do these reforms run contrary to the USMCA? It's a huge question because they don't inevitably run contrary to the USMCA, although they could. The USMCA requires, for an example, an independent judiciary, which looks like the judicial reform will eliminate. But Sheinbaum insists that it won't, and she's going to try to manage the situation rhetorically so that it appears as though the judiciary is more independent. We also don't know what's going to happen with the judicial reform. In the near term, at a minimum, it's going to create a great deal of uncertainty. It also could create chaos and a constitutional crisis. So that's going to be challenging going forward. But the other is the proposal to eliminate autonomous regulatory agencies. And specifically the Competition Commission. According to the USMCA, Mexico must have an independent competition commission. But there is the argument in the Mexican government that by moving it into Economía, you don't necessarily remove its independence. You can create an independent organism within Economía. That's the argument. So I think there's going to be a lot of questioning, a lot of doubting, a lot of challenging and testing to see if these run counter to the USMCA. Second is energy. Sheinbaum is an energy nationalist. That's not going to change in Mexico, but there's a lot of daylight between what she wants to do with energy policy and what López Obrador did with energy policy. And I see the biggest opportunity for some policy change here for 2 reasons. One, because López Obrador has made it possible, and secondly, because she believes it's necessary. One, he made it possible by declaring the CFE completely rescued and declaring that the CFE now generates the majority of Mexican electricity. That's a sleight of hand. It really doesn't, but that doesn't matter. If he says it does, and I believe he's estimating at 63%, then Morena will believe him, and it gives her flexibility to allow for more private investment and private investment in clean energy and maintaining that 54% of generation that must come from CFE. So I think she's likely to encourage private investment both in clean energy generation, but also in self-supply. The restrictions on self-supply will be tighter than they were under López Obrador, but I expect that will come back. She's also going to need to invest in transmission. She's recognized that. She has no budget to do it, so she'll probably turn to public-private partnerships to achieve that. So room for more private investment in the electricity sector. She's also doing this, her interest in electricity is also driven by nearshoring. Unlike López Obrador, she's all in on nearshoring. She firmly believes this is necessary. She wants to encourage it in the first instance by providing this source of clean, reliable, and reasonably priced energy. She doesn't support nearshoring because she's a free marketeer. Quite to the contrary, she is not. She supports nearshoring because she understands that Mexico's main source of revenue now is tax revenue. And to increase tax revenue, you to either put pressure on firms to pay more of their taxes that they're supposedly not paying, or expand the pie, grow the economy. And the main source for growth in the near term is investment related to nearshoring. So I'll leave my opening comments at that.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. You've really given us a lot to think about. Your point about so long as she toes the AMLO line, she'll continue to have the support of the movement. But if she deviates too far, the movement might begin to pull out. That's a really interesting and important point, and be interested to get the views of the other two panelists on that as well. But that's the raw politics of any political calculus. So, Pam, thanks so much. And we'll come back to you here in a couple minutes. But Kim, over to you. You've also been a keen advisor and indeed observer of the U.S.-Mexico relationship in private sector, in the nonprofit world, in government at very senior levels. I think all of us want a good, close, vibrant relationship between the United States and Mexico. Whether we want to or not, we're neighbors. So, how do we make this work with the incoming administration? What do you see as, frankly, some of the opportunities for that collaboration? But then also, Pam listed a couple things that might be of concern. What are some of the obstacles to that relationship that we're all looking for?
Thanks, Eric. Hope everyone can hear me okay. And thanks to the Council and COMEXI for having us this morning. It's great to be here with Pam and with Secretary Meade. As you said, Eric, I've been doing this for a long time. I've worked with the PAN, I've worked with the PRI, I've even worked with Morena in my last job at the State Department, and I could not agree more that all of that has been premised on the notion that all you ever want is a safe, successful, prosperous, resilient Mexico. That's all you want, and certainly, that's what you try to work for in policy. Sometimes in fits and starts, that's fair enough, but that's always been the goal. And I want to zoom out just a little bit, because I think we're actually at a fairly significant inflection point here, and I think that President-elect Sheinbaum has a generational opportunity to transform Mexico in exactly the way that the 4T, the 4T is talking about. But I also think the risk and the risks that some of the changes that are being made entail really is probably as significant as the opportunity. And a lot of it is going to depend on what choices Mexico makes in this first year, as Pamela said, but I think in these early months. And what I see right now is that, broadly speaking, for 30 years since NAFTA, we've had a sense that between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, we should do more together, whether it's trade, whether it's, the Meade initiative that started in 2008 on security, that we're better off, broadly speaking, when we do more together, right? And that's been sort of the baseline. And I have to say, what I'm seeing in Mexico now, and there's an elephant in the room, which is the reform of the judiciary that has now passed the Senate and is working its way through the state legislatures as we speak. That is the first of a whole series of reforms that, as Pam said, were put forward earlier this year by President López Obrador. And those reforms are really, really transformative for Mexico in a way that I think is going to have very, very significant implications if they are all passed in a form that is relatively close to how they were proposed. And I think, to begin to think about what the opportunities are and what the challenges are, we have to get our heads around the fact that these reforms, including the judicial reform, are going to have a very significant impact on Mexico. And I think, I would go a little bit further than Pamela to say that there is no question in my mind that this package of reforms runs counter, at least to the spirit of USMCA if not to the letter of it. And it is very, very clear to me that if they all pass in this form, I was in Mexico a few weeks ago, and everyone was taking pains to talk about the USMCA review and say it's a review, it's a revisión, it's not a renegociación. What I would say is this: if Mexico passes this series of reforms, either now or in the early weeks and months of President Sheinbaum's term, Mexico is in of itself changing the rules of the trade agreement that it signed in 2019. It will be effectively carving out large sections of the Mexican economy, from energy to agriculture to telecom to how they do mergers and antitrust matters, all the things that Pamela mentioned. They will be carving out those things and saying the trade agreement no longer applies. And so what I would say to you, these are sovereign decisions. Absolutely. Mexico can make a sovereign decision to change the rules of the game. But as Mexico decides to do that, I would argue Mexico has begun to renegotiate the terms of the USMCA. It's not something the US and Canada are necessarily looking for. I don't think the US and Canada have even fully internalized this yet. But if you're the new government coming in January here in Washington, and you're looking at the situation, and you look at what was written in that agreement in 2019, and then what these reforms could mean for what's written on that page, I think we are already in a renegotiation process if this full package of reforms passes. And again, I don't think that's quite landed yet, in either in DC or in Ottawa. I would also say that kind of thing, going into an actual renegotiation of the trade agreement in the current environment in Washington, where the two parties are on trade, and without the tool called Trade Promotion Authority, or Fast Track, in place, so that if any significant changes were made to the USMCA, they would need to pass new implementing legislation through the US Congress without Fast Track. I see a very, very significant set of risks around that. And I actually hope that in the final passage, if these reforms do go forward, that there are significant changes to them, so that what I'm spelling out now is not quite so likely. I would also just add, on the security front, which is an area I've spent a lot of time on in my career. One of the real concerns I have on the security front, and I think that the new government in Washington is going to have to completely renegotiate the bicentennial framework security agreement with Mexico for a whole host of reasons that we can get into. But the most primal one is that since 2008, our security cooperation with Mexico has been premised on the idea that we share responsibility, and for the security situation, the homicides in Mexico, organized crime, and the effects in the United States with the fentanyl overdoses and all that's going on. And we have been trying, and the United States indeed has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to build an independent, capable judiciary in Mexico, supporting previous judicial reforms that were undertaken by Mexico to try to modernize the system. If you start going through the reports, it's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars we have spent on trying to build an independent judiciary in Mexico. I think that just changed. And so you cannot go forward with a new government here in January with the same old security program that you had before. The fundamental premise of everything we do on security just changed. And so I think we're at this inflection point, because if you look at the trade relationship and you look at security relationships both broadly, these changes are absolutely fundamental. And frankly, that is President López Obrador's intent. He fundamentally wants to change the model. And so I think we're at a real inflection point where the opportunity is enormous for a President Sheinbaum. And if she recognizes the potential of nearshoring, that is wonderful, because it's there. But I think the risk is also very, very significant. And quite honestly, in the 25 years of doing this, I thought I had seen the relationship at its best and maybe at its worst in my previous job. I think things are about to get a lot more difficult than I ever could have imagined. And I wish I could be more optimistic, but I'll stop there for my opening comments. Thank you.
Kim, thank you. Sobering, but realistic. For those who may not be familiar, give us a very quick sense of what is the Bicentennial Agreement.
So the bicentennial agreement is the security cooperation agreement that's been passed by the United States Congress. It's basically the outlines of the previous Merida initiative, which at its time in 2008 was a groundbreaking bilateral security agreement between the United States and Mexico that covered a whole bunch of areas. It covers everything from addressing membership and trying to get to troubled youth and prevent them from joining organized crime, to things like training of prosecutors and police and chains of custody and things like that. But it's a significant bilateral security program that is currently managed by the Department of State.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. And thanks for those great opening comments. We're going to go now to the other side of the border, José Antonio Meade. You've heard some of the comments from North Americans. Are you seeing it similarly? But I would like you to focus somehow, at least initially, on the economic agenda of the incoming president. Kim has rightly, in my view, referred to the importance, the centrality of USMCA for Mexico's growth agenda, and both she and Pam have talked about nearshoring. Do you see that the economic agenda, the financial agenda of the incoming administration will be sufficient in your mind to generate the type of economic growth that Mexico requires to create jobs and improve the economy?
Yeah, so thank you, Eric. Wonderful to share the panel with Kim and with Pam. Straight off the bat, sending your good vibes and prayers to Sergio because of what he's undergoing in his family. But secondly, so I think we need to do more of these sessions and more of these seminars, because I think there's been fundamental shifts in the last 10 years that we haven't fully internalized. And I'm always surprised. You look at the biographies of Hillary Clinton, the book written by McMaster, the biographies of Obama, Clinton, Kerry, etc. Mexico's not there, which is quite surprising, because that's a divorce between the centrality of the relationship and how important that is, and how little attention it is paid to in many of those circles, in the circles that drive policy. And it's not just Mexico. I think it's Latin America. And I think that the shifts in Latin America have been huge in terms of actually making it so that the framework within which we used to look at the US-Mexico, US-Latin America relationship has changed dramatically. So when we were in the same circle, not just talking from an academic perspective, but actually doing stuff, if we go back 10 years, you had the Pacific Alliance, Mercosur negotiating with Europe and upgrading that agreement, the Pacific Alliance talking with Mercosur, Colombia negotiating peace, the US and Cuba was becoming sort of reacquainted, Argentina on the verge of yet again renegotiating its debt within the context of the IMF. And all of that was predicated on the centrality of freedom of movement of people, capital, and goods. And we thought that liberal democracies had it made. Latin America was growing. Poverty was much less extreme. So because of all of those reasons, we kind of thought we understood that we were finally converging, and we were finally converging around a set of common shared beliefs within the region. You go back to CELAC in Cuba, or the Summit of the Americas in Panama, all of the continent was there. All of the heads of states were represented. You couldn't do that today. It's been 10 years where we haven't had any single summit of any kind of any regional body that is able to agree on the minimums. And I think we need to step back and try to understand why it is that Latin America and the US seem to be hollowed out at the center, and that the debate tends to be around extremes. It's not that Latin America is moving to the right or to the left. It's that Latin America is moving beyond those extremer versions of the left and extremer versions of the right. And I think that the question is, why are they being successful electorally? And what it is, in terms of what they're saying, that makes these changes attractive. Now, having said all of that, because I think that requires to have a framework, because if we don't understand those trends, then we won't understand what's possible in terms of the relationship and what guardrails we have for dialogue. If you look at Mexico's economy, growth was subdued, to say the very least, in these last 6 years. It's going to be an administration that did not grow a lot. But then if you go deeper within those numbers, you come out with two surprises. The Mexican exports grew 9% per year in real terms for the first 4 years of the administration. We were not talking about nearshoring. We're talking about nearshoring today. And I think that we have the narrative backwards. It is not that Mexico is going to grow because of nearshoring. It is because Mexico grew that nearshoring is a real possibility, and that the scope of nearshoring is huge. Suddenly, Mexico seemed to be a good solution to many problems. You had a global pandemic, value chains were strained, and the only place globally where value chains were not interrupted was North America. You have pirates in Yemen, and that makes it difficult to access the Mediterranean. So for all of the countries that rely on trade and moving stuff from Asia to North America, you wish you had a presence in Mexico. It suddenly doesn't rain in Panama, so the canal doesn't work as fluidly as it did. And suddenly you wish you had a presence in Mexico. So within all of this uncertainty that Kim and Pam correctly points out, and with a terrible political environment and a lot of noise, because the exports in Mexico are almost going to double in the last 6 years, which is a pretty surprising number in terms of all of the things that what we have been talking about. The other interesting aspect of the economy is within a government that provided no support to families or firms around the pandemic, consumption in Mexico is pretty strong. So behind those subdued numbers, there's a pretty dynamic export sector that is growing at rates that are almost Asian, and a pretty resilient consumption sector that is doing well. Now, if you look at the Mexican economy, there are strains, and both Pam and Kim identified many of them. And we don't know how those strains are going to be resolved. And there's two possibilities. Either there's some virtuosity in the way that the strains are solved, and therefore Mexico has a very huge potential in dealing with them, or the strains are not resolved, and then they become full-blown fractures, and the Mexican economy goes into difficulties. I'll give a couple of examples. Mexico exports, the energy content of Mexican exports is higher than the labor content on Mexican exports. So if exports almost doubled in these 6 years, that means that there's a lot of strain in the energy sector. Now, if the incoming administration can find rules of the game where people now feel comfortable in investing in generation again, then that does two things. It opens up a very dynamic sector to do profitable investment, and it anchors more participation in Mexico that has proven to be a good solution to many global questions. Pam said as well, we're not just strained in terms of generation, we're also strained in terms of transmission, because so greening the energy matrix and electrifying more stuff means that the stress on transmission has been huge. Again, that opens up a challenge and an opportunity. If you put forth good rules of the game in terms of allowing more private participation in strengthening the grid, then that in and of itself anchors growth, and having a better grid actually anchors again with more investment in Mexico. I'll give another example, Pemex. The way that Pemex is today, clearly a challenge. If you don't fix it, then that becomes a drain, not just in Pemex, but it challenges the sovereign. If you find a way to manage Pemex better, because of the size of Pemex, that becomes again another source of growth for the economy, and you do away with the challenge on the sovereign. So I think that what we have today is a lot of uncertainty. I would nuance some of the things that Pam said. There were two Claudias on the trail. One of them was supportive of AMLO's constitutional agenda. The other one was basically saying, similar to AMLO, the fourth transformation is over. Now the private sector and the public sector are at the same level, so we can negotiate the terms of understanding again. And if that renegotiation process takes way and it's successful, Mexico, I think, internally has good structure. And in terms of the USMCA, I also think that there's been a shift of paradigm, because we tend to think of USMCA, and I'll stop there to give more time for more participations, but we tend to think about the USMCA as a negotiation between Mexico and the US. And really, USMCA, because of the way that trade has evolved, is a negotiation between Mexico and the US and the structure of the value chains, which are North American in essence. And I'll just nuance that in a way that I think brings it very starkly to the forefront. Mexico and Russia have very similar sized economies. If you do the intellectual exercise of thinking that Russia were to disappear tomorrow, we would miss them globally because of oil and gas. If Mexico were to disappear tomorrow, there's 20 value chains where chaos would be would make itself present. So the world would literally stop if Mexico were not part of the equation because of the centrality of the North American value chains. So as we look at USMCA and try to think how that happens, I think, again, a shift in paradigm makes sense because it's not Mexico providing raw materials and the US transforming them, or Mexico getting raw materials from the US and transforming it here. It's basically a decision as to how you structure the value chains in a way that allow North America to remain competitive. And North America cannot be competitive unless the US and Mexico and the North American value chains are part of the equation. So USMCA, as we revisit them, is going to be a renegotiation of North America within itself. It's going to be a conversation with those value chains in terms of how we want to structure them going forward. That was the case of USMCA as compared to NAFTA. It was basically a negotiation between the US, Mexico, and the automotive sector in terms of how we wanted that automotive sector to look like. And I think that that sector now has huge competition from China. So either we structure it in a way where Mexico and the US make it so the North American value chain supporting automotives become competitive, or we're not going to be able to compete with China. So I'm reasonably optimistic that we come out of that negotiation well. Now, as both Kim and Pam said, that doesn't mean, so the centrality of Mexico to be part of North America is not resilient to everything. If Mexico chooses to de-anchor itself away from providing certainty and independent judiciary, that's a problem. If Mexico de-anchors away from providing certainty in regulation across its agencies, that's a problem. Now, whether there's only one way to provide independence, I think that's questionable. So the challenge for the Sheinbaum administration is how do the stress that we see in the Mexican economy is channeled? And there's possibilities for the administration to provide for good answers. And the second challenge is having had a qualified majority that the market did not expect and that they actually did not win, because we have said many times here, Claudia Sheinbaum won 60-40, but the vote for the deputies was 53-47. So it's very hard to argue that you have a popular mandate. Rather, it was a very abusive use of the coalition, a very aggressive litigation that allowed them to transform a 53-47 vote into a qualified majority in Congress, but there was no popular mandate to talk about. Now, whether you're able to channel that without the anchoring is the values that are central to the North American process, but I think that serves Mexico well. And just to round it up, I saw the debate yesterday, and Mexico was surprisingly absent from that debate, at least in the terms that we usually were. That is not to say that everything that Kim and Pam said are true. The U.S.-Mexico relationship, regardless of what happened in the debate, is going to bring forward very complicated dialogue in terms of fentanyl, security, trade, China, etc. But my impression is that in the worst of the political environments, with the least amount of dialogue, if you just look at the numbers, you wouldn't be able to tell, because the numbers have proved to be pretty resilient.
Well, we've had 3 brilliant interventions so far. That was fantastic. Thank you, Jose Antonio. Thank you, Pepe, for those comments. I thought you were going to say, when you were saying it's a renegotiation, not just U.S. and Mexico, you said supply chains. I thought that's where you were going to say Canada, and hear all of our Canadian folks on this call cheering because they oftentimes feel that they're overlooked. But no, Canada is very much a part of the USMCA, and we applaud them. But your comments initially about the changing, atmosphere over the last 10 years in Latin America, and frankly, if I can say, the lack of appreciation and understanding in the United States about that, and the need for reorientation of our own view, I think that is a really important point, and I would concur on a personal level. I would concur with that completely.
sorry, just to put, of course, Canada, and the same thing happens to us when we say that the Caribbean. Yeah. No, but the other thing is, it's not dissimilar to what's happening to the U.S. politically. So I think that what's interesting about the comments is that it's also dramatic how much the debate in the U.S. has changed. So you have in the U.S. a similar debate around the Supreme Court and whether that arrangement is the right arrangement or not. So all of these, all of the things that liberal democracies allowed in terms of discontent, I think are relevant for Latin America. I think they're relevant for the U.S. and I think they're relevant in many of the electoral processes that we're seeing. So it makes sense to do more of this.
Yeah,
as we think through that.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. Let's go back to Pam. The idea of nearshoring, constitutional change, inflection points. U.S. has our own elections, which is not the purpose of this call, but we certainly use that. I mean, that's certainly out there for sure. All of that adds to the uncertainty of the moment. No, and you work with a lot of companies and investors, and is this vision realistic for Mexican growth? To draw investment, nearshoring, that sort of thing, or are investors a little bit skittish at this point because of the uncertainty and the renegotiation or review, what you call it, of USMCA and the constitutional reforms? I mean, how are you seeing that? Give us a kind of a snapshot of how your investors are talking to you and some of the things you're hearing.
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of investors that are already either in Mexico or even in clean energy. There are investors who are convinced that Mexico's need for clean energy will outweigh any of these other matters. So in that sector, you do have a lot of interest still in Mexico. But at the same time, there are a lot of investors that are just sitting on the sidelines. And they're sitting on the sidelines just to see what this qualified majority is going to bring, and the judicial reform is not something that made them happy. But they're not sitting on the sidelines just because of what's going on in Mexico. They're sitting on the sidelines also because of the U.S. election. Their concern is that if there's a Trump administration, there could be a disruption of trade with Mexico. And so they're concerned about whether or not Mexico makes sense, and not just because of what's going on in Mexico. So there's that added bit of uncertainty. But the interest in Mexico is still profound. There's enormous amount of interest in Mexico. It's just this uncertainty about whether or not they're going to be able to operate effectively in Mexico. And that's something they're just going to wait and see.
So it's not a uniform picture. I mean, everybody's taking it on their own interests, but
obviously every sector and every company is different. But the broad picture I'm seeing is that it's a wait and see attitude for most money, the biggest chunks of money.
I think that's an important insight. Thank you for raising that with us, Kim. I want to come to you on an issue that you dealt with when you were Assistant Secretary. And it's prominent now, and will be prominent in the USMCA discussions, and that's frankly China and China's role in Mexico. I mean, some of the investment that's gone to Mexico, frankly, in terms of nearshoring or what have you, is not U.S. or Canadian investment, it's Chinese investment. That plays differently in Washington and presumably Ottawa. What are your thoughts about that? Is that an issue that Washington is overly seized by and, we're overreacting, or is it something that it's there and we're just going to move forward? I mean, how should we be looking at that really important issue?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think it is part of the additional reason I think that we're in for a renegotiation is that issue is, in fact, it's taken root even on Capitol Hill here. And there's a couple of points to make about that. One of which is obviously China has overcapacity in a number of sectors, and you see these individual agreements with Mexico and other countries about steel and aluminum and about various other things. I've heard of all kinds of other products that are starting to come up in terms of their overcapacity and attempting to move supply through friendly countries to gain preferential access to the United States. So I think that's going to be an issue. And as the Secretary said, especially in autos, the central issue is how do you maintain a competitive sector, automotive, particularly in electric vehicles, with a China that is able to make very, very inexpensive electric vehicles and is looking for avenues to access the U.S. market. So I think there's no question that that's going to be a central issue. But one thing I think is it bears reminding, I agree 100% with the notion that there's never enough attention in Washington given to Mexico, with a few exceptions. And there's always been this notion that in Washington, we sort of taken Mexico for granted for a long time, that, we just sort of rely on Mexico being there, and we just sort of put it on autopilot and take it for granted. I would argue that I think we're at a moment where maybe the reverse is true. And I think that Mexico has taken a little bit the United States for granted in some of what is going on. And the reason that I say that, if you look at this issue of nearshoring and friendshoring, and you look at what's driving it, it's, for the United States at least, this is a national security question about whatever word you want to use with China, either de-risking, decoupling. De-risking seems to be the new term. But this is fundamentally a national security issue. And you talk about nearshoring and friendshoring, and the implication is that you want these supply chains, particularly in products that are important inputs for the US economy, to be in friendly countries where you feel that the investment is safe, where it is secure, where you have long-term stability, where you don't have to worry about supply disruptions being driven by geopolitics and things. So you're looking for friendly allied places for nearshoring. And one of the things that that worries me, and I don't want to overblow it because I think some of this is symbolic, but if you look at what's going on in Mexico and the Russian army marching through the square on Independence Day last year, and you look at the position on Russia, Ukraine, or Mexico's position on Venezuela and issues of democracy, and you start to look sort of down the list, and you watch the president's press conferences and see what he says about the United States. I think we should be really mindful that it took 30 years to build this relationship, and it's built on trust and enormous amounts of investment by the private sector. But we have to be careful of it. We have to mind it, and we can all take that lesson. The U.S. side, the Mexican side, even the Canadian side. We have to mind this relationship. It requires care and feeding, and at least some level of sensitivity. And if we're looking at, nearshoring, again, for the United States, this is a question of national security. These supply chains need to be in places that are secure and reliable. And it's a set of questions that I've started to ask myself, as I see what's happening in Mexico. And I hope I don't need to ask it anymore. I hope when President Sheinbaum takes over that these things fade into history. But I think we're at a moment where the opportunity, as I mentioned, is historic. I would be delighted if Mexico would take advantage of it, but I do think it requires some commitment and some sort of reassertion on the part of Mexico that it wants to be part of North America, and it wants to play by the North American rules, and it wants to engage in this way. And I hope that that's what we're going to see.
That's great comments. I really appreciate that, and you framed it out really well. And I've been really remiss in not inviting into the conversation Amy Glover. And Amy, I apologize for that, but
no, I think that was the plan, really.
To you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say I loved those points, Kim. I think as a binational, that's something that is always very interesting to me, that we still don't understand each other very well. I think the U.S., Mexico has poked the U.S. consistently over the last 5 to 6 years. I don't think they understand the sensitivities that the U.S. has to things that are critical to U.S. national security, like issues related to Russia, like issues related to China. And frankly, it's been quite, insulting. But it's interesting that Washington has learned not to react because they know the sovereignty sensitivities that Mexico has. So it's been a lot of, okay, let's just let it blow over. Let's not respond. And then we see when finally, in my opinion, I think Ambassador Salazar was quite slow to take a bit more of a energetic approach when he criticized, or not criticized, but rather said, the U.S. is concerned about this judicial reform. President López Obrador said, well, we're just going to put the relationship with the U.S. and Canada on hold. Oh, really? Oh, okay. So to your point, it is interesting, too, to note that Mexico doesn't have a clear strategy for nearshoring. This investment comes in, but there's no clear promotion strategy. Mexico has no clear strategy for how they want to develop or have a relationship with China. So I do think it goes both ways. And I would be interested to know what the thoughts are about the Alliance for Economic Prosperity in the Americas, which seems to be an attempt to address what Pepe Meade mentioned with respect to kind of ignoring Latin America too much. I think there's an acknowledgement in the US that because there have been so many other geopolitical distractions, that's happened a bit, and that this alliance is somewhat of an answer to China's inroads in the region. And in fact, there's programs specifically focused on semiconductors that are opportunities for Costa Rica, Mexico, and some other countries. I'd be curious to know how you see that developing, if that's something that is important or not.
Very good. If anybody has thoughts about the Kim or Pam or Pepe.
Yeah,
Pepe.
Can I just jump in briefly?
Please.
Because people say that the U.S.-Mexico relationship has been sort of studied and diagnosed to death, and I don't think it has. And I think that we don't have a clear understanding as to what the underpinnings are, and a couple of surprises. Also, steel, because Kim mentioned it. So in the U.S., periodically they say, well, we're going to put tariffs on Mexican steel because they're being used as a platform from China. Then they put tariffs, and it turns out that Mexico buys more steel from the US and the US buys from steel. So Mexico reciprocates, and then suddenly people find out and are surprised by the fact that actually the steel relationship doesn't work as you know, because politics would have you believe that it works. And I think that the other part of the equation that we kind of need to think a little bit deeper to is you know, how China fits into the equation in the following way. We tend to think, and I think that Kim said it in passing, but I think it has deeper underpinnings. We tend to think about China as a very big market and a manufacturing hub. Really, the first global sort of Chinese brand was Huawei. And how we dealt with Huawei within our markets was interesting, was nuanced, was complicated. 10 years ago, that was it. And so China's manufacturer, big market, we want to be a part of that. Then 10 years after, suddenly it turns out, as Kim said, China became small for the Chinese brands. That's a different discussion. That's a different debate. Because suddenly it's not China coming in through the US via Mexico, which, by the way, they don't. They come into the US via Vietnam, and they come into Mexico also via Vietnam. The bulk of investment in Mexico continues to be North American. 97% of foreign direct investment last year was reinvestment from people that were already here. So there's, again, a discontinuity between what we're saying and what's actually happening. The Mexican exports to the US have not become more Chinese intensive. The Chinese content in the delta of what we're now selling to the US is pretty much the same as it's always been. A foreign direct investment continues to be reinvestment. We're not getting a lot of new investment because of nearshoring. It is basically people that were already there doing more. But vis-a-vis China, I think that we both, the US, well, all three of us, the US, Mexico, and Canada, when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean, we need to stop and see whether this is the same China that we were dealing with 10 years back, whether the challenges and the aspirations are the same. And I think that it brings a lot of granularity to USMCA, because the fact that some of these companies are now becoming global and very competitive, if you look at the market share of Chinese cars in Europe and the market share of Chinese cars in Mexico, but the growth that we have seen in their market share was huge in the last couple of years. And there the debate is not really trade. There the debate for Mexico, and I think for the US, is what role do we want China to play in the finished market goods? Do we want them investing in North America? Do we not want them investing in North America? And I think that one final point in terms of what Kim said, for a very, very long time, we were very clear as to what the American values were. And I think that sort of helped bring about those 10 years back that I talked about and anchoring around liberal democracies, the amount of change that's happening in the US politically makes that hard to be understood. So 10 years back, having a Latin American president disparage the press would have been unheard of until you had a US president disparaging the press. And that sort of changed the degrees of freedom. You said, and I agree, because national security, you had a 70-year-old very successful alliance with NATO. And suddenly you have a US president really questioning whether that alliance makes sense and how they should think about it. So I think that the reason I bring all of this up is there's less certainty in Latin America as to what those rules are, because I think there's less certainty in the US. And the amplitude of the things that are being debated in the US are much wider than when they were 10 years back. And that trickles into generating yet another sense of uncertainty. Because now, as Pam was saying, we have uncertainty as to what the judicial reform is going to do. We have uncertainty in terms of how Claudia will renegotiate her relationship with the private sector. We have uncertainty surrounding USMCA and China, what that means. But we also have uncertainty in terms of where the US stands on many of these issues, because the width of the debate, the change in what was valid in politics and what wasn't valid in politics, to the point of questioning the peaceful transition of power and questioning the electoral result. That also the anchors many things here in Latin America. So I think that is why I think that this exercise that COMEX is doing, the time when it is doing it in the context of the Mexican election, will allow us to rethink as to what those parameters are, because they become a little bit less focused, they become a little bit less narrow, they become a little bit less predictive.
We're beginning to come to our appointed time. We don't have a lot of time left, and Amy, I'm going to give you some time at the end for your own concluding comments, and I'm looking forward to that. But before we get to that, Pam had a request to jump in here as well on the topic. But then there's a question that's come in, which is a really important one. I think it's on the minds of everybody. It's come in from David Agron, who's one of the observers here on the Zoominar, webinar, whatever we call these things. And it's a very specific question. Is Claudia Sheinbaum the Medvedev of Mexico? And we all know who the Putin would then be, right? So, I mean, is this, Pam, you talked about it in your initial comments about independence and that sort of thing, but, you know, this is it's a model that's not unknown around the world. Is that relevant here to Mexico? But Pamela, to you, please.
Yeah, let me, before I refer to that, which I'd like to, I'm going to come back and talk. Kim had made some really interesting and important points about the bilateral relationship. The fact that the big question is, to what extent will China become influential in Mexico, whether it's economically or politically, or Russia or other U.S. adversarial powers? To what extent is nearshoring actually seen in Mexico as a national security issue for the United States? And to what extent will Sheinbaum's foreign policy look like López Obrador's? I think to answer all those questions, we have to get into López Obrador's head in terms of how he thinks of the relationship. And he, as a child of history, is who he is, he thinks of the relationship in very much in historical terms. He's trying to get the relationship back to something much more like what it was under the PRI than what it was under what he calls the neoliberal period. And it's a relationship that was much less of an embrace of the United States and more holding the United States at an arm's distance. Obviously, with an enormous caveat that Mexico is much more dependent on the United States in the past. But what we had was a strategy in which Mexico had a great deal of autonomy, policy autonomy in foreign affairs and domestic affairs, but it had strict limits. And the limit was always U.S. national security. Now, historically, that was the Cold War. But over time, migration has become a national security issue. Drugs have become a national security issue. When Mexico realizes something is a national security issue, it tends to fall into line, not always happily, but it'll fall into line under López Obrador. That's what happened with migration. It's what happened with fentanyl in particular. And at the same time, López Obrador is very sensitive about people saying things in public about him. This is another sort of unwritten agreement that came from the past. Disagreements should be aired in private, not in public. So for dealing with López Obrador is the best way to deal with him is to air disagreements in private and make it clear when something's a national security issue. Sheinbaum's going to be a different person. She's not a child of history like López Obrador is, but she is going to be influenced to an important degree by the nature of that relationship of trying to build more domestic autonomy within the interdependent relationship, within the limits of that relationship. And as Kim was saying, I think with Mexico, we're going to have to renegotiate this relationship. It no longer is the relationship we had over the last 30 years. It's going to be something different, but it's based on that different perception that the fourth transformation has of the relationship, not an embrace, but autonomy within limits. And then with regard to the question about is Sheinbaum going to be the next Medvedev? Yes and no, because López Obrador is not going to break Mexico's tradition of no reelection. So he's not coming back. This is Mexico, and I think that tradition is something that's sacrosanct to him. He's also not getting any younger. But on the other hand, he is positioning his son to be the next president of Mexico. That's clear. And it is something that no Mexican president has ever attempted to do. It's something quite striking. Whether it'll work or not, we'll see. But that clearly, that seems to me fairly clear that that's what he's trying to do.
Fantastic comments. I'm really just so pleased with the panel that we've had this morning. I mean, it's just amazing. The insights, the wisdom, the historical sweep. Amy, I mean, I don't know. Can you top all of that? Is that
I don't know. That's pretty tough. I don't know, Kim, do you want to jump in first?
Yeah, just one quick comment on that. Sure, so I think if I were advising any of the campaigns in the U.S., what I would be telling them is basically, you've got to give the president-elect a chance. And this is a woman who has governed a city whose population and economy is larger than that of many countries. And so she's obviously a very capable person. She's a very talented person. And I think her management of the city is something that is well seen. And I think there's some lessons there. And I would also say most of the cabinet sent pretty good signals, I think. And so, looking at the data that we have, which is her track record of the city and her picks for the cabinet, okay, I think we need to give her a chance. I definitely have the sense that she is her own person. So I think at the end of the day, we need to give time. I think the challenge is going to be when you have a new government that comes in January, whoever it is. The USMCA process, whatever we want to call it, renegotiation, is already going to be well in train, and there's not going to be a lot of time to get moving. So, but we should pause and see how she orients the country in her early weeks and months.
Pepe, do you want to chime in?
No, I agree. I think in Mexican's political liturgy, there's no space for two. So I think there should be no question in anybody's mind that Claudia will be president, and that she will design her own policy. She will be her own woman, and I think it's pretty exciting that it is a woman. And I think that she won on the basis of her votes. I think she clearly, again, as I said at the beginning, because there were two campaigns. One of them made the constitutional amendments that Andres wanted her own, but the other campaign was based on moderation and was based on the fact that we could, be brought back together to the table to find a new agreement. And I think that it was that moderation, that openness, that actually made her win in the convincing way that she won. And I agree with Kim. We should give her space to deliver.
Yeah, I think those are really good comments, and leaves it kind of on a hopeful note. Although I do think after the conversation, what is like the main theme here? It's uncertainty on both sides of the border. And that's not the best of news for investment, because investment wants certainty and wants to find ways to reduce risk. So I think as we look towards 2025, that's going to be the challenge. I think we've wasted a lot of time over the last several years without a really ambitious vision for the region of North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to reinitiate some of that next year. I think the private sector and civil society will play a critical role in kind of providing some of those ideas, the data to try to, push the governments in that direction. Because, certainly over the last couple of years, the U.S. has been distracted. Mexico has looked increasingly inward, has had less of a high profile internationally. I understand that's something that Claudia Sheinbaum also hopes to change, which I think is hopeful. And I think the whole issue of sustainability generally is maybe a focus that could be positive for the region. And when we think about the challenges at the border, when we think about the energy transition, water resources, and issues related to security issues, organized crime, these are issues that we can't solve by ourselves. And they are challenges that we face as a region. And I think the only way we can, have the prosperous future that we're looking for is to think in a regional way. And I think it behooves all three countries. And it's also a trend that we see happening globally with kind of a reduction in multilateralism and an increasing kind of way of thinking of things from a regional basis. And I think North America certainly has a lot of comparative advantages in that sense. So I'll pass it back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Amy. That was great, encapsulating a lot of really important ideas. I do want to correct myself. I mentioned the wrong person as the author of the question that we asked. It's David Muir, and I apologize for that. This has been a terrific conversation. And I would love to do it again. Jose Antonio, your idea, I think, probably resonates with all of us, but that means you all have to come back and join it. You have to speak. So, but with that, I want to thank our partners at Comexi, just true professionals. And on behalf of the Council of the Americas and our members, thank all of you again for your time. Thank all those who are watching. We had hundreds of people online watching this, so I think it was a great success, and we'll see what comes out of it. But let's be watching after both October 1st and November 5th, and we can continue the conversation at some point. From Washington, I'm Eric Farnsworth, delighted to be your host. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. This will conclude our session.
Thanks, everyone.